Okay, and excellent. All right, so welcome everybody to this live webinar. I'm going to speak for about 20 minutes, 25 minutes, just in relation to what the Native Woodland Co-op is. For any of you who caught the first webinar that we held a few months ago, this is a little bit of an update on this based on some things that we've learned since, but also, I guess, some of the progress that we've made. So, yeah, I'll fire through this as quickly as possible. And I guess if we go back to the very beginning when we first looked and even discussed what options that we had, we initially went out to try and really find ways that we could actually plant native trees in a relatively cost-effective way. But as we started exploring various things, we wanted to have the democracy and transparency around doing this. We felt like there were a lot of organizations, charity structures and things like that, that we didn't always feel like that level of transparency was there. We wanted to put something in place which utilized and made the grant income, I guess, available for all those who were involved, but also have something that had the transparency that we wanted. And once we discovered a co-op, we realized pretty quickly that that was going to be the best setup for us. We reached out to the Irish Co-op Society, who is kind of a governing body, I guess, of co-ops, and they were quite happy to work with us and liked our business plan. And we started on heading down that route. And I guess one thing to note is that we really do see this as something which is going to make a major difference. So you guys might be aware that we have our first land purchase ready to go, which is planting 12,000 trees. We're not doing this because we want to plant 12,000 trees. We're doing this because we ultimately want to scale up to plant 1,000,000+ trees. So that's kind of our vision, is very much about doing this at a big level, but also allowing ourselves to get as many Irish residents to join as possible. Some things to note there, that we typically try and find land which has provided an income based on around 5%, 5 to 6% gross annual returns. I'll talk about this more as the presentation goes on, but also that in terms of our own governance, we're governed by a handbook or a rule book, which is a little bit like a constitution. Again, look, no doubt there'll be questions on this as well, and I'll discuss this more as the presentation goes through. So if we just look back to actually what a co-op is, and again, I touched on this in the first presentation, so I'll quickly run through this now for those who were there. But effectively, we do see co-ops all around us. Credit unions are probably the best example, but we see co-ops in relation to kind of supermarkets and things like that, where you can go and buy things from the co-op and things like that. Kerry Group was originally a co-op, obviously very, very successful company in farming. So they eventually moved into be a public listed company, but originally they were a co-op. Similar to, I mean, the actual setup is similar, and the tax and everything like that is quite similar to a company, but usually they're based more around than just profit, rather than just profit. So it's not just a matter of looking for profit at the end of it. It's actually trying to find a sort of a cause that we can all get behind. And in our case, native trees, obviously, and native woodlands is a good one for that. One of the big difference with a co-op is that every shareholder, regardless of how many shares they own, has an equal vote. And obviously that makes it quite different from a company, where in a company status, one person might own half the shares and as such have half the vote. We don't have that with a co-op, so it's quite good from a democracy point of view. And the co-op, for us to get established, we had to actually get 7 individual shareholders or special members to start the co-op. So we actually elected a board based on, we had about 12 people apply, and we eventually elected 7 individuals, and they were the 7 founding members, if you like, to actually get the co-op started. It should be noted that none of us knew each other beforehand, and that we've come from all parts of the country, which is quite nice as well. The board itself, I think I've mentioned in the past, it is a voluntary board, and they're actually elected by the shareholders, so by the members themselves at the AGM, very similar to how an association would work. The accounts themselves, they're actually audited every year, so we get them professionally audited by a third party. And one of the nice things and one of the great things about a co-op structure versus some of the other legal structures that we looked at is that a co-op can have an unlimited number of shareholders without an additional cost per shareholder. So we originally looked at, say, a private company model, where every time we added a shareholder, there was going to be a cost for the company's office. There's going to be a cost for one of the for a lawyer and so on to issue those shares, and we were going to be limited by the number of shareholders that we could have. With a co-op, that doesn't actually come into play. We can have as many shareholders as we deem, and the shareholders are basically verified by the board, and the board can deem how many shareholders that we have. So that's quite powerful from that point of view. And I guess I've kind of touched on this already, but why a co-op? So yeah, I mentioned that some of the other models there, they just didn't quite have the same scalability as a co-op, but also it just seems to make sense from a point of view of that democracy and transparency structure. We wanted to be able to get as many people involved from as little as possible, and a co-op certainly allows us to do that. And we wanted that transparency and democracy. And we also wanted an organization where investors were ultimately the ones who were in control, and that we had the interests of the investors and the interests of the managers were actually the same. And we don't always see that in investment models, whereas with what we're trying to do with the co-op, it actually allows us to do that because the board is effectively shareholders who are just stepping up into a management role. So I introduced the team at the beginning, so I'll quickly just run through this. So no doubt we'll be hearing from David later on in the Q&A. David is particularly experienced when it comes to some of the sustainable farming aspects of what we're trying to do, and that's really, really important from a long-term income point of view. So I'll touch on that a little bit later on as well. David's based in County Louth. My name is Michael. I'm the secretary. If you guys probably noticed, I don't actually have a Limerick accent, so I'm originally from New Zealand. I moved to Limerick about 10 years ago. And yeah, so we kind of, Dave and I kind of got together and managed to get the idea off the ground. And then we've got a few of the other guys: Aaron, Alice, Marie, Nathaniel, and Paul. So yeah, we're fairly, like I said, we're a new board, but we seem to get on quite well already, and there's a lot of synergy there, which is great to see. So, I mean, I guess one of the questions that we asked ourselves very early on is why do this? And again, we kind of come back to that notion that we felt like if we're going to do this, we actually want to make a real difference. So I mentioned that 1 million native trees goal. We generally all believe that there is a viable market for native forests, and it's just not currently being done. So, you know, most of the commercial forestry tends to rely on non-native trees, the Sitka spruce in particular. And there wasn't necessarily a huge amount of, I guess, you know, there wasn't a huge number of examples of people actually doing this and companies doing this. So we wanted to explore that as well. And we wanted to give Irish people that sense of ownership when it came to native woodland. So most of you are probably aware that the majority of native woodland in Ireland has actually been chopped down over the years. I think 99% of it has actually been chopped down or forested over the years. So we wanted to actually try and reverse that trend and start regrowing some of those great native woodlands that once were there. So again, that's one of our kind of mantras and something that we actually want to achieve. In terms of our progress to date, so we launched everything under the branding of Love Trees, and that was really just a page that was going to be actually about just getting the idea of native trees and promoting native trees out there. Guys, I'm just going to check the chat quickly. No worries, Keith. So yeah, so in terms of the actual branding, we originally just wanted to see, and I guess it was a page that I actually started myself, just to see around the idea of, is there any interest and any passion when it comes to actually native trees? And we quickly found out that there was. We actually ran a couple of surveys, and that was really, really powerful just to get feedback from people around what we could do. And one of them was they wanted to have some sort of model around being able to buy native woodlands or establish native woodlands as a group. So that's where the idea of the co-op largely came in. We got the 7 board members together. There was a lot of paperwork to get done. So we spent a good couple of months on business plans and just getting paperwork done. When lockdown wasn't as severe, Dave actually drove around the whole country collecting all 7 signatures. So that was quite an exciting week to get all of that done. And finally, in September, we got notification that the co-op was registered. It took us then another 4 weeks to get the bank account set up with Bank of Ireland. The bank manager that we dealt with had, in 31 years of being a bank manager, had never set up a co-op account. So that was, again, quite a challenge. But finally, we actually managed to get everything set up last week in terms of the bank account. And in the meantime, we were accepting pledges, and we've had pledges received of over 100,000 euros from around 120 people, which is absolutely amazing. We're currently collecting those pledges, and we've received nearly half of that so far, which has been great to see. In the meantime, we actually signed a land deal. So while this is going on, we actually we really wanted to hit the ground running. So we actually have a land deal ready to go. It's a site up in Roscommon, and we'll be planting 12,000 trees. So we're excited about that. That's going to cost us around 41,000 euros to purchase. And so any extra money, we want to try and get another land deal, and we are already in discussion on potentially buying another site. It just depends on how we go in terms of raising some funds over the next week or two. So this is the actual site that we've looked to purchase. Again, apologies, I'm not actually Irish, so I struggle to say the pronunciation, but Cool Tejas, I think is what it is, how it's pronounced. Dave will correct me later on that. And just to break down the numbers on this, so I mentioned that the overall purchase cost is around 41,000 euros. The site itself is 8.1 acres, and there's 12,700 native trees to be planted on it. The annual grants, so you guys are probably aware that the Forestry Service pays grant income for 15 years. It's tax-free income, which is nice, and it works out at almost 2,300 euros per year, which is a gross return of around 5.5% every year for 15 years. We can also leverage a one-off grant, which works out at around 3,400 euros from a new scheme that was only set up in the last year or two from the Forestry Service called the Native Woodland Fund. And the nice thing about this site in particular is that forestry approval is already granted. So it's a matter of us actually getting the land purchase, getting the deed, and then the forestry management company that we're dealing with is actually ready to go and start planting, which is perfect timing because the planting season only started yesterday. And the board felt that this was a good first site to test our business model. So in terms of sites and pricing to buy it, it's probably one of the cheaper sites that we could buy for the size and things like that. It still had a fairly good return. So we felt this was a good site to actually get things going. And it seems to have proved to be true so far. So I mentioned that we are looking to raise more capital, ideally to purchase another site, largely because for the co-op has some fixed costs, which are largely accountancy fees and insurance, but beyond that, there's very little variable costs. So it makes sense from a return point of view to try and scale as quickly as possible. And so we do have another site that we're particularly interested in Knock in County Mayo. This would allow us to plant another 30,000 trees, and the cost of this site all in, with all the other associated costs, is around 100,000 euros. So yeah, we're hoping to try and raise around 150,000 euros, which would allow us then to buy both sites, but we'll just see how funds go in the next week or two. So in terms of how the forestry industry works, now for some of you, you guys might be aware of this. For others, this might come as quite a surprise on how the industry actually works. It's something that Dave and I have managed to learn over the last couple of years. So we do have we have built some really good relationships with some of the forestry management companies. But the forestry management companies are effectively kind of where you go to when it comes to actually wanting to get some forestry planted. And you've probably seen them around. There's quite a few of them around. We're dealing with 2 in particular at the moment, but there are sort of maybe 10 major forestry management companies. Typically then you can only plant on greenfield land and various types of high quality agricultural land typically. So this kind of differs from a lot of the thought in the olden days, back in the 50s and 60s, they were largely planting on hillside land and peat. That's all changed now. So these days, the land typically needs to be of quite a good quality. And any land that you actually try to plant trees on, you need to get planning permission or planting permission, afforestation approval. And the actual planting is actually covered fully by government grants. So there's actually no cost or zero cost to us to actually get the trees down. Our cost for every site that we look to buy is literally the land purchase, the stamp duty, the land registration cost, and the solicitor fees. So in terms of actually what we need to do, it's actually fairly passive once we've actually identified the site and paid the money and signed the contract. Everything else is then kind of handed over to the forestry management company, and they actually plant for us. And then they also actually look after the site for us, as included in the cost for the first 4 years. And there's a small management cost after that if we want to have them maintain the site. But that's something which we'll get to in due course. After that, then What we get as a landowner is that we get these grant premiums, which is paid out by the government for 15 years, and it works out typically around 5% per year. Obviously, it depends on the cost of the land, will dictate how much that return is, but based on the sort of land that we're buying, we typically aim to try and get a 5% return from that. Effectively, what that means is a €100,000 investment would yield around 5,000 per year from the grant income every year for 15 years. Ed, I will get to what will happen after the grant funds. So, yep, that will all come in due course. And actually, it's coming right now. So, yeah, one of the biggest things, and Ed's obviously identified that, is that what actually happens once the grant income stops. And obviously, that's one of our biggest concerns when it comes to actually doing this, is that we don't want to be effectively making forests that become nothing more than giant land banks and aren't actually useful for anybody, because after 15 years we stop managing the forest because we're no longer interested in it because it's no longer producing any income. So a lot of the stuff that we're trying to do, and a lot of the scalability aspects, and the reason that we feel like we're quite a good investment from that point of view, is because we're going to bring with us the ability to hopefully leverage a lot of other relationships and partnerships to actually utilize other ways and find sustainable ways to actually produce additional income from the land. And already Dave and myself have had some good relationships with some government officials and people in the forestry service and various other stakeholders, which has been very, very interesting already at the early stage. So it should be noted that a lot of these things are long-term opportunities. They aren't things that are necessarily going to be, we're going to be exploring in the next couple of years. But as Dave and I will often say, and what we say on the board, we have 15 years to put something together. And sometimes it's quite hard to try and predict 15 years into the future. We're talking to the year 2035. So it's probably fair to say that the world will be quite different then. But we see, and the list that I'm going to go through now is kind of is the opportunities that we have. And the truth is, if any one of these come through, then we're going to be doing really, really well. So the first one is actually the native woodland fund that I talked about earlier. So that's something that we do get from year one. But some of the other opportunities are just around, whilst this is a forest that will not be cut down, there's still an opportunity for us to get firewood from the thinnings. So obviously there's a management aspect of the forest, and thinning is actually good for the trees. It actually helps grow them. So there's an opportunity to sell firewood from that. The carbon market is huge and kind of untapped at the moment. At the moment, the carbon credits are actually given to the government automatically. But some of you guys may have heard that Lidl has actually taken the Irish government to court at the moment to try and see if they can actually claim the credits for themselves. And there's also going to be opportunities in the future on the voluntary carbon market. So at the moment, there isn't really a carbon industry in Ireland per se outside of within the government. But my gut feeling is that that is going to change in the future. So it's very much a case of wait and see. Some of the other things we want to do, there's potentially other crops that we can be harvesting. So hazelnuts and fungi and various other crops. So we can be looking at things like that. Beekeeping, we're already establishing some partnerships with beekeepers. So there's potential there. Forest farming and free-range deer farming, education. So one of our board members is actually involved in an education company, and there's potentials there to actually, bring kids to the forest and let them explore the forests and things like that in the future as well. Tourism and recreation, this is obviously something which is becoming more and more popular. We see this already with the state-owned forests, that they do offer recreation and tourism as well. So there's potential for us to do that in the future. Commercial forestry, in terms of the continuous forestry practices. So again, that's where the forest per se isn't chopped down, but we do harvest maybe some of the trees, or we leverage it with some, a mixture of trees, some that we do plan to actually cut down, others that we don't. At the moment, again, we haven't explored that, but it is an option. Some of the people that we've been talking to actually just say, look, biodiversity is going to be huge and it's going to become a bigger thing in the future, and there's going to be grants available and there's going to be opportunities there. So again, similar to carbon credits and the carbon market, the biodiversity market, something which isn't yet there, but it will be in the future. Environmental protection opportunities, again, similar to biodiversity. Natural burial grounds, memorial forests, things like that. So there's all sorts of things that we're going to be able to leverage, and we do have some good relationships and partnerships with potential people that we can talk to around that. Renewable energy, this one's quite interesting, but a lot of the sites that we buy, we can't leverage all of the land for forestry. So some of the site may not get forestry approval. So we're trying to work on a partnership with some companies that might want to put solar panels down on the land that we can't actually plant trees on. Because obviously for a lot of those solar panels, they're a little bit of an eyesore, but if they were to be surrounded by forest, then that might be quite a good way to produce energy, produce renewable energy, keep them hidden from public eye, and also get our forest planted. So we'll see how that goes in the long term. And then something which is a little bit more short term is just around the branding and an online store, and selling products. So one thing that we're working on as a co-op at the moment is a kind of a mini forest, if you like, something that you could buy and actually plant at home, but just also selling prints and photographs and paintings and things like that, and just trying to kind of leverage the idea that any of that profit will go towards planting more native trees. So just utilizing the brand of the co-op and sort of that good sort of democracy and transparency and all of that sort of stuff, is something that we plan on working on actually relatively in the short term, in the next 6 to 12 months, as things progress. Sorry guys, let's check the chat again. Okay, it's fine. So yeah, just in relation to, I mentioned earlier that not all forestry, not all land is actually suitable for planting. So it needs to typically be greenfield land only. The number of trees planted per hectare to begin with is 3,300 trees per hectare. At year 18, there's a good chunk of thinning carried out. So a lot of those trees that are originally planted are actually then removed. Effectively, what happens is it's a matter of the forestry management company come along, and the trees that are growing and have grown the strongest will be left to grow even bigger, and the trees that haven't grown as well will be taken out. So it's a natural part of establishing a new forest. It's quite important to note that the forest will never be cut down. That is part of the grant, part of the planting process, and part of taking the grant income is that that forest cannot be legally cut down. So that's actually quite powerful, and it's something which is really nice in Ireland in the sense that it's actually kind of put into legislation that that forest must remain. Um, and whilst the land is privately owned and will be privately owned by the co-op, there is an option in the future to allow public access. So there is something called the neighborhood woodland scheme, which would allow us, if we wanted to move into that recreational model, to move in that with the neighborhood woodland scheme, and that actually pays some money to actually get the path set up and things like that. So again, there's various options in the future around that. So in regards to the co-op and what we're actually looking to do, and what we are actually doing is we're effectively looking to raise funds from shareholders that will go directly to purchasing land and setting up the co-op. So thankfully the co-op is now set up. It only costs us around 500 euros to actually set up the co-op. So the costs are relatively low in the end. So any of the money that we're actually raising is being used directly to purchase land, and that's something which is quite important to note. And one of the reasons that we consider the investment to be fairly low risk is because we're actually buying assets that will go up in over time. So it's not a case where you're investing in, say, a private company or a startup company, and that money might be used into marketing or anything like that. In our case, any of the money raised is going directly into the actual land purchase. Um, we're the share price is in multiples of 25 euros, so you can get started for as little as 25 euros. Um, and the profits themselves are distributed every year. So every year we will pay out a dividend. The dividend itself, because, assuming it's from the forestry premiums, which it will be, is actually income tax free. So it's only the USC and PRSI that is payable, which again makes it a fairly good investment from that point of view. And there's also the option, if you want to, the dividends can either be paid out into your bank account, or they can be reinvested or compounded into more shares. So every year the shareholder will have the option to either pay it out to a bank account or to actually buy more shares and compound that money altogether. And we're typically looking to pay out at least 4%, every year. Now, Dave will always tell me that I shouldn't be even suggesting that, because none of this stuff is obviously guaranteed, but it's a case of assuming everything goes well, that is kind of our as our goal, I guess, as a board, to try and look to get a 4% dividend paid out per year. It should be noted as well that a co-op works slightly differently from if you're buying shares within the share market or something like that. So there's a couple of differences that are worth pointing out. The first one is that the share price itself is actually fixed. So our share price is actually fixed at €1 per share. So if you were to buy €25 worth of share, you're actually going to get 25 dividends in the co-op. and that share price doesn't actually change. So when you go to exit your investment, you will get your money back effectively. But what you're actually getting when you buy into the co-op is you're getting the ability to get those dividends. So that's really, really important to note, just around how that works from that point of view. I just want to, yeah, so there's a couple of things. I'll come back to exiting the investment and talk about that in a minute as well. So there are some other costs just to be aware of. Again, guys, just give me a minute just to take some water. So there is some insurance. That's relatively small, though, in the scheme of things. So that's typically only runs at a few €100 per year. There's accountancy and auditing costs. So we actually managed to get quite a good deal through the accountant that we're using. The auditing obviously is an additional requirement that a private company wouldn't have to do. But again, it's probably good to know as an investor that the accounts themselves are being validated by a third party. And those costs work out all in around €2,500 per year. So again, at scale, it works out quite well. I mentioned forestry management services costs. So they will be there in the long run. In the short run, they don't really exist. They may not really be a considerable cost until year 18. Sorry, guys, I'm starting to lose my voice, which typically happens. Marketing and web development, it's not really something we've had to deal with yet. I'm actually a web developer by trade, so I've been able to just do things in the short term. There may be some costs for marketing in the long term, but a lot of those costs we see will actually be tying into the online store that we talked about. So from a shareholder point of view, they aren't really going to be costs that are going to be a factor. We really want to utilize and keep the shareholding, keep the grant money for shareholders, and try and utilize everything else we can for marketing and things like that. There may be a need for compensation for management. At the moment, we're all in volunteer positions, which is fine. Depending on the workload, that may need to change. And then obviously bank fees and travel expenses and things like that. So they're the sort of costs there. For the first few years, we're really just trying to run everything as we can on a shoestring, and really just utilize and get things going as much as possible. It really isn't a matter of worrying about a lot of these things until we actually start to scale. And then in regards to exiting the investment, so shareholders can actually opt to sell their shares, well, typically any time, but I would recommend they try and do it at least on an annual basis, just so that we're not too under pressure to try and get them sold. Basically, you can effectively sell them to somebody else if you want to transfer them, or you can ask the board to sell them on your behalf. The way that it actually works is, and this is something which was quite new to Dave and I, was that the shares themselves aren't actually passed on. It's more of a case where the shares are cancelled out, and so you effectively your money's paid back, the shares are cancelled out, and that new shares are issued. So rather than the shares being transferred, it's more like they're replaced. So it's kind of important to note that, and it should just be noted that ultimately it's up to the board to decide, when and how those shares are sold. So it is a case where if for some reason we had a lot of members try to sell their shares at one time, obviously that's not something that we could do if we don't have buyers. So it's important just to note that it could take a couple of months for those shares to be sold, or at least replaced, if you like. But again, we kind of would encourage members to say that forestry is a long-term investment, and the way that we see it is that you're getting a good regular tax-free dividend every year. And so trying to buy into that notion that we are here for the long run, it's quite important. We've built this co-op up in such a way that it will be here well beyond our own lives. It's something for our children's children to really have and enjoy. So a big part of that is to really look for the long run when it comes to that. And so the question that we really asked today is would you like to take part? So we are currently looking to raise up to €150,000. The minimum investment will be €25. And for many people, they're happy just to put in a few €100 or a couple €100. And, if they get a return or not, that's great. For a lot of other people that we've seen so far, they've put a lot more money in, and obviously a return is important. Obviously for Dave, myself, and the other board members, we have put in a lot of money of our own money as well. So, getting that return is obviously very, very important for us as well. If you guys are interested in making a pledge, you can just go to nativewoodlandcoop.ie and just fill out a very quick form, and you can actually register your interest. The last thing to note is that I mentioned at the beginning that all of this stuff is about long-term scalability. So everything that we're trying to do here is actually about scaling and making it bigger and getting to that goal of planting 1 million trees. We want to become a market leader in establishing new native woodlands in Ireland. So that's actually really, really important. And so, yeah, I finish on this slide just to say, would you like to get involved? I am now going to hand it over to you guys. If you guys have any questions, I might take a break for a minute just to recover my voice. But yeah, if you guys have any questions in the chat, Dave, I might just pass it over to you if you want to have a look through the chat and ask any questions.
How you doing, guys? Apology about my internet connection earlier on. First of all, I'd like to thank everybody for coming and listening to Michael and myself and our other board members answering questions on the chat as well there. So we really appreciate it. Michael's done an excellent presentation. He's getting better and better at this, so he's covering pretty much everything. So there's very little to say, bar maybe answering some questions afterwards. The main point of what we're trying to do with a cooperative is to do the right thing. And we are very much doing this, not just for investment, but because it's worth doing for the environment. It's worth doing for the carbon cycle, for the water cycle. It's worth doing to get trees in the ground to help regenerate soil for future generations. It's not happening at the moment. The forestry industry is fantastic in Ireland. It has been developed since the 1950s, but it has been focused on softwoods. Now, softwoods have built all the houses and roofs that are over your head today. And they will remain as a requirement into the future. So we're not trying to replace that, we're trying to add to that. And the softwood industry is indeed changing, as Michael talked there. So going into a sector where they're planting on where it had been on cheaper, what would be have been deemed as cheaper land and unappropriate soils in the 1950s. But that was the science they were dealing with then, and now they're dealing with new science, and the department is making leaps and bounds to try and make things better. So we don't want, what we want to do is partner with agriculture. There is a lot of land out there that's not being utilised properly. Agriculture itself is going to change, and we would envisage that forestry will be part of that, and that you will have silvopasture and silvoculture, which is the growing of food products in forest. And you will also have animals that will browse and graze in forests in the future too. And along with that, there will be a requirement for biomass, which forests can produce and achieve a lot. Effectively, forests harvest sun energy and the water cycle, and they help to clean the water. So forests that have been planted in places like Sussex in the UK with the Knepp estate, which was what they call rewilded, would have helped to alleviate flooding in local towns where down, and it would also have helped to start to regenerate a large area of dead seabed as well. So they really are fantastic. They connect the earth, the air, the sun, the sea. Forests connect to all of that. And I'm in this because I love trees, I love forests, and we really don't have enough native forests. So the majority of people don't know what forests are like. They see Sitka plantations, and that's where they go walking. And it's great that we actually have that. But let's look to a future where we can actually walk in a native forest that's actually working, that local people are working on the land. One of the questions there I saw was from, sorry, apologies, I just scrolled down here. There was a question there in relation to the labour side of the project. Yes, it would be part of our grander plans. So what we're targeting at the moment is marginalised gains. We are separating out what we need to do to get started, which will be our first in Coolteague. And that will effectively cover the basic costs of the co-op and also give a small return. If, however, we can move towards the second landmass, we can give a much better return to people sooner, quicker. And as we work on new projects, we will go to our current shareholder base. We will ask for investment from themselves if they want, or to help share the spread the word as well, and maybe bring other people on board to the cooperative. So we can invest in new projects, as Michael touched on. I think that's a very, very strong idea. It is the future. Currently, I think what can be measured is that about 5 billion tons of carbon per year go up into the air, and that investing in the carbon market, in actually planting trees, will help to do that. So planting trees can get investment and also do the right thing. It can produce healthy forests for everything from forest bathing to food, etc. And to do that, it will require jobs on the ground. So labour would definitely be something we would intend in the future to actually be an employer as well, as a cooperative, and to be brave on the market and to investigate what others might not deem completely suitable. So we have a lot of ideas for different projects. But there's probably another couple of questions there.
So Dave, if you even want to go to start at the start of the chat, there was a few questions asked that we haven't actually answered yet. So
okay. I'm looking at kids' bedtimes and stuff here.
So yeah, I'll actually take one if you want, and then I'll jump back to you. So Jack, you asked just the typical planting layout. So yeah, I mentioned they plant around 3,300 trees per acre. That's actually set up by the Forestry Service. And then the type of trees that are planted as well is also set up by the Forestry Service. So they have different planting grants. There's 2 for native woodlands, and this is various different tree species there as well. And yeah, I think somebody also mentioned just about, is there an opportunity for us to eventually plant our own trees and produce our own trees and even potentially do the planting ourselves? Of course, these are all things that we can do in the future. So, where the co-op goes and just how big it gets, the sky is largely the limit. It comes back to that scalability. But if we were planting 1 million trees a year, then it would probably make sense for us to actually be doing that in-house rather than outsourcing that to a forestry management.
We could also point out that the second landmass, while it contains about 32 acres, the plan would be for about 19 acres of that in forest.
Oh, Dave, we just lost you for a minute. So yeah, Dave was just saying that there is some kind of land that won't get forestry approval in the new land that we want to try and buy. So we could be leveraging that by planting some shrubbery on it, and other things like that, which is fairly exciting. There was a question there about ash dieback. So obviously that's been a concern. One of the nice things about utilizing the native woodland grants versus the other grant categories is that those trees have to be reliably sourced natively or native to Ireland. So a lot of the problems of the ash was that they were actually imported from Holland, whereas the trees that we will be planting are actually native to Ireland, not imported. Now, they can't guarantee that. It's a little bit like when you buy a chocolate bar and it says may contain traces of nuts. But we do know and have a relationship with the supplier of the trees. Some of you guys may be aware of the company Non So Hardy, and they will be supplying our trees for us. And we've kind of been quite specific with the forestry management company that we're using. The forestry management company we're using for the first site is actually called the forestry company. So if you guys want to take a look at them, you can. But they've been are well aware of what we're trying to do, and sort of said to us, look, we will make sure that these trees are sourced natively. So that obviously will help in terms of the disease control and things like that. But again, obviously what happened with ash is very, very upsetting. But the hope would be that, sorry, Dave, I'm just checking that you're trying to get back on. The hope will be that that doesn't happen, but it does. There is typically grants available anyway. Dave, I'm just going to mute you until you get back in. It looks like he's trying to reconnect now. So guys, I'll just go through some of the other questions as well. So yeah, Sean, that kind of answers your question. So there isn't a guarantee per se, but they should, in most cases, they will be doing their best to source trees locally, which I understand they have them at the moment anyway, which should be fine. Yeah, Connor, your question there just about buying smaller patches and expanding them. We haven't looked at that yet. We're quite keen just to get trees in the ground initially, but yeah, we might expand on that in the future. Again, if you want to visit, and make visits, we have had a couple of shareholders reach out just to ask for maps and things like that. Yeah, that can be done. We don't know yet what the rule is about going on site, but for a lot of the time you can see a lot from the roadway anyway. So if you wanted to validate any of the stuff that we're doing, you certainly can. We have plans to, we've got I've got somebody working for me who has volunteered his time to actually go and document the process of us planting the trees, and he's got a drone. So we do want to actually document the whole process, which we think would be quite exciting in terms of just a bit of publicity as well. Yeah, to Sean's question. So Sean just asked about, yeah, I'll come back to both these questions. So Sean just asked about the shares. It's not that they can't just, I mean, if you wanted to sell shares more than once a year, then that would be fine. It's just more the overhead of the board trying to actually sell them. So we try to say to members, look, if you can let us know on an annual basis, we suspect most members will get their dividend, and then they might decide at that point to sell, as long as they give us sufficient notice, and that's absolutely fine. And then, yeah, if you wanted to buy more shares, the way that it's going to work is we will effectively, as a board, agree an amount of shares that we're going to buy. So in this case, we're trying to raise 150,000 euros. Once that's raised, then we won't accept any new pledges until we decide to raise more capital for another site. Once that comes, then existing shareholders will actually get the first right to purchase those shares. So that process works exactly the same as it does within a company. So if you own shares in a company, you would get first right. It'll work the same within the co-op, and then whatever shares aren't taken can go out to other people to purchase. Just check. Are you back now, Dave?
Yes, I am. Yeah,
Good
I'm on
man.
the phone. I'm on the phone though, so it's hard to read the chats.
That's
Questions.
okay. I can actually. Do you know what? I can read the question for you, and you can answer it.
Yeah,
You'll
if
save
you
my
read
voice then.
questions, I can
Um,
probably give answers. So
Perfect. So Finn asks, the forestry management companies, can they be instructed to plant various species or a pattern um, for making sure that they're the best for the ecosystems rather than for their ease of management? Dave, you've probably got enough of that. I can answer that too, but you want to have a crack?
yeah, but basically, what you have to plant is what would be native and what would be suitable for the soils in the area. There is an argument that's out there at the moment that what might be known as non-native may have to be part and parcel of every country's forestry into the future if we want to use forestry from a design aspect to fix problems globally, from carbon content to supply for construction, etc. But realistically, on the land that we're working on at the moment and what we intend for the future is all native trees. And there is actually quite a good supply there. None So Hardy and other companies have assured me that they've given me the numbers and what they actually have in stock. And the forestry companies need to get to work as well, because there's been a big delay there. So anybody who can come on board and actually buy land and that's pre-approved and help them out, you're going to be supporting jobs in the Irish economy next month, this month, November, if we can get this started. Both our sites are actually approved. There's plans done for both these sites, and they would include oak, for instance, your birch, alders, aspen. So there'd be quite a wide spread. And then the biodiverse areas, we would have the choice to maybe put in everything from the strawberry tree, which is actually a native Irish tree from Kerry, but they believe it would have been all over the country at one stage, right across to crab apples, and tried some different areas, and then just leave some to nature. But what designed planting does, in my opinion, and from what my reading of it on land use across Europe and across America as well, is it will regenerate. It helps nature work faster. than waiting for an oak tree to be dropped by a raven at some stage on your land, which is what, leaving it to wild is effectively waiting to happen. You will get willow species, but in 20 years' time, you'll still have those willow species and nothing higher. And what we want to do effectively is we want to create a good forest floor. We want to have a good bush floor, and then we want to have a tree canopy as well. And in growing all them together and then taking down some of the trees that aren't progressing as well, you allow light into your bushes and you allow light onto your forest floor. And that allows for everything from your nematodes in the soil to your small forest creatures. Ponds would be important as well, that it may be that we might have to put in ponds or allow spaces for ponds to develop in the future too. They would add to cooling. Literally cooling of the earth. So the more forests we can get in the ground, the faster we can cool the earth as well.
Excellent, Dave. I've got a question here from Melinda that we missed earlier. Now, she's actually an ecologist, so hopefully we can answer this to the best of our knowledge. But she just wanted to elaborate a little bit more on the greenfield sites. And, she kind of asked, are they biodiversity poor? And do we get environmental surveys carried out and things like that? Now, again, Melinda, most of this is actually done by the Forestry Service, Forestry Management Company for us, and most sites typically do require an environmental study these days. So that's typically done, and then that's checked by the Forestry Service. So I would just point out before I pass over to Dave that, like, we can't just go there and go, oh, we'll just plant this tree here, we'll plant this tree here. You get a mapping, you get a plant mapping, which shows exactly what trees are going to be planted where, and that's all approved by the Forestry Service, and an environmental study and survey is done. Typically on most sites, I think at least 85% of land sites will have an environmental survey done. There's specific rules that will govern if one needs to be carried out. Dave, do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, I just add that there may be some greenfield sites where there's a degree of biodiversity already. If it's been intensively farmed, that biodiversity is probably not there. There are rules and programs in place for hen harriers. Indeed, there's payments as well. So as a co-op, you can get paid for supporting grasslands from Europe for the likes of hen harriers and snipe, etc. They're not huge payments. It's not what our business model side of things is, but this is not just a business model. This is what I would call a recombinant solution. So we're taking the best of the science and the design and the business side of things, because let's face it, we live in an economy, and if you want to fix things, you got to work within that economy. You're not going to fix it outside of it. So we have a business side to us, and we have a brave side to us, where we want to help nature, work with nature. But I think it brings us to the important thing, that biodiversity always has to include humanity and how we live on and with the land. And obviously some people might live in cities, and they don't get to see an awful lot of forests, but would like to be invested and in touch with it for the benefit of the fact that they'll get cleaner air, and their children will get cleaner air, and other people will be on the land locally, and jobs will be important to them locally, and nature will be important to them locally. And we want to take all of that into account, and not be accepting of the fact that, oh, you have to choose one or the other. Maybe we can do one thing here and another thing here. So it's forest here, native forest here, biodiversity here, and over here, because it's suitable, you've got your construction industry, timber, and you've got your agriculture. And agriculture will always gain around forest sites, because it protects the soil from erosion and heavy rain. It manages rainwater better, which means that your vitamins and minerals don't get washed away in heavy rains. I think soils in Ireland, for instance, would normally, once you get over about 1.5 inches of rain in a day, they won't soak it in quick enough, so that it actually runs off on the top layer and will take soil, take minerals away. So a forest nearby will always capture that, and because it grows out in its roots and its connectivity with animals, etc., that returns that back onto the soil. So the biodiversity does include humans, and we have to realize that as well. It's just we need to work with it.
Excellent, thank you, Dave. That was great. So yeah, I just want to run through this to see if there's any other questions. So yeah, just in regards to the Mayo site, look, we're still in the early days of that. If anybody's not in a position to pledge now, then by all means follow the Facebook page. There'll be other opportunities in the future, but we do feel like it's a great opportunity to get in now, and obviously to try and get things running now. Yeah, Fian just asked about the renewable energy. He just kind of says to tread carefully on wind energy. It's not really something that we've actually discussed yet. But yeah, and again, the solar panels is very much a new idea. It's something we're still trying to work on. But as I mentioned in the presentation, all of the things I mentioned, are all possibilities. And it really, for us, it's about leveraging one or two of those long term, which would really make a difference. And I know it sounds strange, but time is on our side, and to a degree, because we have 15 years to actually work this stuff out. But obviously, we want to work that out sooner rather than later.
Sorry, Michael, can I just come in there on solar?
Please do.
I mean, we all know from the board, this actually rose its head when it was mentioned last week. So it's very, very new. And it's through some study and investigations I've been doing myself on it, and attending some carbon conferences to understand what the market is going to want in the future as well. So solar is just it's just an idea. What we're about is getting trees in the ground. But as a cooperative, we believe that in managing land, and that's what we aim to do, is help to manage land in an inclusive way with nature. That for people to live in that land, you're going to need electricity, and it's going to need to be to decarbonize the economy worldwide. We have to make sure we produce as much electricity as locally as possible to where it's actually used, and that will mean solar. And it's more effective if it's done in larger sites, about 25 acres. So what we would aim in the future is that we buy a 100-acre site, put 25 acres of solar into it, that partner with ESB, get a great return for our shareholders, and have a beautiful forest around it. And underneath those solar panels, you can have a beautifully diverse natural habitat that develops under there as well, with grasses, etc. And they're getting better and better at actually planning those sites too. So both the Forestry Service, BSB, etc., are all invested in this. But what I would say is really good things are happening here, and there's opportunity. And from speaking to people that are invested in this and who are working in it, their biggest problem is that they spend a lot of time and effort and money working with landowners who then say, yeah, that's a brilliant idea. That's a great plan. We've done the EPA, everything. And now I'm just going to sit on it and see what the next cap reform brings and see how much I can make out of it. And that's fine. I get it. They want to make money. They own the land. That's fine. But if the opportunity is there for us to buy the land, and for people who aren't connected with the land, and to do things a little bit better and help the powers that be, the invested government services and private services that are working in this area, they'd love to be working with someone like us, because we have to answer to our shareholders. So we have oversight. We have oversight because we have to trade according to government rules. If we're utilizing grant systems, we have to take into account Natura 2000. We have to take into account the European directives, the directives on birds, the directives on land use, the grant directives. There's a huge amount of oversight. There's a huge amount of work to actually be done. But it means that we can do things quicker as the landowners. So investing in the co-op, we believe, will return momentum for both shareholders and also for nature.
Excellent, Dave. Very, very well said. Guys, it is approaching 9 o'clock. So yeah, thank you everybody for joining. I'm just seeing if there's There will be a link to the presentation, guys. It will be up on Facebook very, very, very soon. So if you are following the Facebook page, then by all means, you'll see it there. I will also likely send it out to, or I will be sending it out to anybody that has pledged to date. So if you have pledged to date, it will be going out to there as well. And Melinda, your question about we had that question before, actually, just in relation to so guys, if you do want to drop now, that's absolutely fine. If anybody wants to stay for any smaller questions, then that's totally fine as well. Melinda just asked, could this work on a smaller scale, so residents in a housing estate purchasing smaller plots from the county council? The way it works is more for large scale, and you don't actually need planning approval if you're planting less than, I think, 0.24 hectares or acres. It's one or the other, so you don't need planning permission in that case. But the reason it doesn't work in like we had some questions, I think, in the last one about trying to buy in the Dublin city or things like that, is the cost of land is too high to justify the actual project. So that's why typically you find the land is in more remote parts of the country.
It has actually been done before, where communities do that, but it's not something where they're going to get a return from it. You're going to put your money into it, and that's it. And you're probably going to have to gift it into a trust. But funding that trust in the future becomes a problem. So it starts to look for donations, and it starts to become a charity. It's specifically why we didn't go down that route. I would say we'd love to have a forest in and near cities in the future as well, as part of what we want to do, but it is further down the road.
Yeah, Keith, you ask if you see land for sale, then please email us, let us know. Yeah, of course, if you guys do see land that looks suitable, or you see it's potentially for forestry, then let us know. Of course, we'll be more than happy to take a look. So yeah, thank you everybody. We will put a yeah, excellent. Thanks everybody. We'll put this video up shortly anyway, and thanks again.